Great Lakes sponsor, Presbytery of Chicago, our Wild Indigo sponsors, Wind Free Solar Wild, ComEd, and Sunrun. Our Yellow Lady Slipper sponsors, the Birdie, Eva, Hezekiah, and Susie Charitable Gift Fund, and our Oak sponsors, the Forest Preserve of Cook County, Jefferson Electric, the Field Museum, and the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Your support allows us to gather in spaces like these, reflect on our collective challenges, and move forward with strength. Now, I am so excited to introduce today's speakers and facilitator. Join me in welcoming Rabbi Ora Nitkin-Kaner and a climate change chaplain, educator, and innovative spiritual leader. She is also the founder of Exploring Apocalypse. Exploring Apocalypse is a trauma-informed climate chaplaincy practice, and she helps individuals and communities across faith traditions explore the spiritual disruptions, invitations, and reorientations of climate change. We encourage you to learn more about her work on our website. And today's facilitator is Faith in Places Northern Illinois Outreach Coordinator, Lashina Jenkins. It is my pleasure to hand things over to Rabbi Ora and Lashina Jenkins. And as always, please feel free to add your questions in the chat, and we will have time for Q&A at the end as well. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Jaleesa, for the warm welcome, and good evening, everyone. I am so excited to be guiding today's conversation with Rabbi Ora Nitkin-Kaner. Rabbi Ora, it's an honor to have you here, and I am really excited to delve into this topic today. So to get us started, I will be turning the floor over to Rabbi Ora for a short presentation. As a reminder to everyone, please feel free to add your questions to the chat, and we'll get to as many as possible toward the end. And now, Rabbi Ora, take it away.
Thank you so much, Lashina. Thank you so much, Jaleesa. Thank you to Faith in Place for inviting me to be a part of this summit. I'm so delighted to be here, and I'm so delighted to be in conversation with each of you. This evening, we're going to be thinking together about the emotional impacts of climate change and also about the spiritual impacts of climate change. And for many of us, talking about climate change can bring up some discomfort, right? And so my invitation to us this evening is, instead of meeting the discomfort with tension, or instead of meeting the discomfort with rejection or with judgment, let's see if we can actually meet it with some gentle curiosity. And in order to set ourselves up for success in doing that, we can actually make sure that our bodies are as comfortable as possible, right? So for many of us, it's dinner time. If you're hungry, please feel free to eat. If you are thirsty, please drink. If you're feeling tired, stretch, move around as you listen and participate. And on my end, I'm going to try to speak slowly. And I'm not going to be sharing slides. So as much as possible, we can see one another's faces and stay in connection. And so this is an invitation now. If you'd like to turn on your camera so we can see your face, we can be part of this community, this collective over the next hour. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna, so many beautiful faces. Okay, so we're going to get started with getting settled and an invitation to breathe. So take a few moments to find a comfortable seat. Perhaps closing your eyes, or simply holding a soft gaze. Noticing whatever sounds or absence of sounds are accompanying your space. Notice what thoughts are arising in you. Noticing your breath. Noticing now any expectations that you're holding for this evening's session. And honor what brought you here. And taking 5 more rich, full inhales and exhales on your own time. See if you can bring a little more softness in. Hey, welcome. I'm going to share just for a couple minutes now about my background and my work before diving into the meat of what I want us to be discussing together this evening. A little bit about me. I started my spiritual care journey in prison chaplaincy and then moved into hospital and hospice settings and also worked for a few years as a pulpit rabbi. And a few years ago, while I was serving a congregation in Michigan, I began to ask myself questions like, what do our hearts need as we live through climate change? I began asking myself questions like, what happens in our souls when it feels like so much in the world is uncertain, or when it feels like so much is unraveling? I began to slowly build a climate change chaplaincy practice, which is now my full-time work. And as a climate change chaplain, I hold space for folks to explore their reactions to the climate crisis so that they can respond with greater awareness and greater agency and greater ease. I work one-on-one with folks from all faith backgrounds, as well as atheists and agnostics. I also do some teaching and facilitation for congregations, nonprofits, and universities. And finally, I lead support groups for specific constituencies who are wrestling with specific issues. For example, women and folks with uteruses wrestling with whether or not to have biological children because of the realities of climate change. So at the heart of my work is helping people to explore their emotional and spiritual responses to climate change. And we can ask, why is that important, right? And the reality is that most public conversation around climate change has really centered around scientific findings and facts, right? So it's really been what is true, what is not true. And so to believe in climate change essentially means, well, I believe in facts. I am aligning myself with facts. And we've been told for decades that we need to act on climate change, right? So we need to act by educating ourselves and others, by donating to organizations, by changing our personal habits, by voting, community organizing. We've been told for so long that climate change is about fact. And we've been told for so long that acting is the moral response to climate change. And we've been told this over and over again, such that we can be a little bit confused or a little bit self-protective about the feelings that climate change brings up, right? Because, of course, we're having feelings about the climate crisis. And those feelings tend to be big, and they tend to be complex, and they tend to be not easily resolvable. And in general, most of Western society really downplays or discourages complex feelings or feelings that aren't easily resolvable. So what do we do with all this, right? What do we do with the fact that we are having what we call climate emotions? But the world, for many different reasons, is telling us, shh. So when the world tries to convince us that we're not feeling beings, we need to get countercultural. And when those in power deny that all living beings are connected, we need to get countercultural. And when the powers that be don't support our collective safety and our collective health and our collective liberation, we need to get countercultural. And one of the ways we do that is by talking about how we feel. And so we are going to sow a seed for revolution together this evening. I'm going to invite you now to type into the chat box, but not press enter. So I'm going to invite you to type into the chat box. You'll have about 30 seconds to respond to my question, and then we're all going to press enter at the same time. All right, so the question is, and it will feel like a very basic question, I'm sure, but I ask you to indulge this small revolution. When it comes to climate change, how do you feel? When it comes to climate change, how do you feel? So you can type a range of feelings into that box, but hold off on pressing enter. Take about 30 seconds to respond. When it comes to climate change, how do you feel? Okay, feel free to write in a couple more of those feelings. All right, let's all press enter. Okay. All right, so a lot of feelings coming into the chat. I'm going to read some of them out, and just remember to come back to your breath, right? A lot of big feelings. Can we hold them with gentle curiosity? All right, when we think about climate change, are feeling hopeless and overwhelmed, but not giving up. We are feeling worried and afraid, sad, frustrated, and scared, heavy-hearted, defeated. Part of the struggle to curb climate change, we are fearful and worried. We are responsible. We are sad and frustrated. We are feeling grief, frustration, inspired, curious, anxious, angry, sad, frustrated. We are worried. We are grieving. We are scared. We are helpless and sad. We are angry. We are peaceful, hopeless and unsure, uncertain, anxious. We are feeling so much. And all of these feelings are real. And all of them are valid. And all of them are important. And part of why we are having such big feelings about climate change is because climate change is shaking up some of our core beliefs, some of our beliefs that really exist at the bedrock of our society, at the bedrock of what we build our lives on. I'm talking about the kinds of beliefs that have guided and sustained us for centuries. So beliefs like safety is achievable. Beliefs like our world can nourish and sustain us. Beliefs like the future will be better than the past. So we can start to see that climate change becomes not just an emotional challenge, but also a spiritual challenge, because it's bringing up questions around trust. It's bringing up questions around hope. It's bringing up even questions of mortality, of life and death. And in the past, whole religions have been formed to try to address these kinds of questions, right? And in many ways, we're having to reconsider some of these core questions, these big ideas in our time. So another invitation now to drop into the chat. Again, you'll take about 30 seconds to type your response, and then we'll all try to hit enter together. So an invitation now to put in the chat, what are some of the spiritual questions or the spiritual challenges you're hearing or noticing emerging around climate change? What are some of the spiritual questions or challenges you're feeling or you're hearing come up around climate change? Okay, so let's press enter now. What are some of the spiritual questions we're holding around climate change? Are we too late? Is change really possible? Is God in charge? And is that spirit a loving, nurturing spirit? How do you worship the trees? Am I lacking in faith because I feel like there is no hope? Is this God's plan? Are we the Judas in the climate story? Are we supposed to fix it? In the absence of a transcendent God, worthy of attention in crises, how do I pray? Is climate change part of the earth and our evolution and simply what is? Are humans able to act? How do we grieve but still move forward? How do we support each other? So we can see, and all of these responses are clarifying for us, that climate change is a spiritual challenge, right? And another way of saying that is that climate change is affecting our minds and our souls. And we know that climate change is an emotional challenge. Another way of saying that is that climate change affects our hearts, right? And in all of this, we can't forget that this really starts with our bodies, right? We are embodied beings, embodied souls, if that's our theology. And on a bodily level, human beings don't like change. Our bodies greet change with a whole bunch of instinctive reactions that are really designed to keep us safe. But what ends up happening is almost any change heightens our animal awareness and increases our alertness to threat. And the changes involved in climate change, they're such a challenge to our body's sense of ease. And that's because the changes that are a part of the climate crisis, they're constant, but they're also unpredictable. They're disruptive. They're on an ever-increasing scale, and they're happening both locally and globally, both near and far. And because of all this, it can really feel like climate change is demanding our constant attention. It can really feel like climate change is demanding our vigilance. And so it makes sense that one of the most prevalent responses across the world to climate change is what psychologists are calling climate anxiety. I'm sure many of you have heard that term by this point. So what's climate anxiety? Climate anxiety is essentially a persistent fear response to climate change. Or another way of saying it is it's a fearful preoccupation with climate change. So I want to break this down for us on a few different levels, right? Because we've been talking about mind and body and soul. So I'm going to break down climate anxiety in that way too. So how does climate anxiety show up in our bodies? It can feel like difficulty sleeping, like difficulty concentrating. It can feel like we are full of tension, full of muscles that have trouble fully relaxing. It can feel like a racing heart. It can feel like we're frozen. It can feel like we want to hide or hibernate. And how does climate anxiety show up emotionally? Well, some of the ways are, a feeling of persistent fear or worry. Focusing on grieving and on grieving what is lost or what we feel like will soon be lost. Climate anxiety can manifest as feelings of guilt or dread. It can feel like anger. It can feel like cynicism. It can result in us feeling hypersensitive, but also in feeling numb. And it can make us feel so alone. So how does climate anxiety show up in the mind? It can feel like cognitive overload, like our brains aren't functioning or like there's too much to take in. It can feel like being pulled towards confirmation bias and away from critical thinking. It can look like engaging in fatalism, fatalistic thinking. It can look and feel like imagining dystopian futures, obsessively reading or watching the news, fixating on our own or other people's behaviors. It can result in a narrowed aperture in our lens of care, with a narrowed focus on self or on family, kind of internal circling of the wagons. All right. So I'm going to pause now, and I'm going to invite you to drop into the chat. What's resonating? What are you wondering about? How's it feeling to hear all this? How are you doing? Go ahead and press enter whenever you're ready. So what's resonating? What are you wondering about? How are you doing? Okay. So thank you, Jane. What can we do to relieve some of this climate anxiety? I promise I won't leave us here. I promise we won't stay only in anxiety and only in challenge. Okay. So we're going to go a little bit deeper in order to go forward and go up. So thank you for being willing to stay with me, to stay with yourself, to stay with all of us, to stay with these challenging ideas with gentle curiosity. So when we look ahead to a climate change future, fear seems to be one of the most common responses, and it feels like a really reasonable response, right? But it's so important to not abandon ourselves to our fear, right? It's so important to not just collapse forward into a fear-filled future. How do we do that? Well, we actually do it by looking back and by getting some clarity on where we come from. So why am I suggesting this? Why would we look back in order to look forward with more hope? So I want to make one thing clear. Our primary reactions to the climate crisis are completely real and completely reasonable, right? I want to be very clear about that. But I also want to share, I also want to share that it's likely that some of our reactions to the climate crisis are also being shaped by our family of origin and by our culture and by our faith tradition. Many of us in the United States, at least, are immigrants or descendants of immigrants. And what that means is that many of us are part of a group or multiple groups that currently experience oppression or that have historically experienced oppression or displacement or persecution. So a shorthand way of saying this is many of us have collective trauma in our past. So if in the past it was hard for our ancestors to feel truly secure, in the present, our dysregulating planet can reinforce some of those inherited doubts about how safe the world is and how safe the world will be. And so that means that climate change can actually reinforce a pattern of thinking about the future with a kind of fearful anticipation. When we come from a family or a culture with a history of trauma, our survival mechanisms will often have become hyperactive. So there's a part of us that's always saying, I'm going to stay alert. I'm going to track everything, and that's going to keep me safe. And if I track everything, I can know what's coming. And if I know what's coming, I can protect myself and I can protect those I love. And what this means is that for many of us, climate change can really heighten or exacerbate our focus on what's coming and on what's outside of ourselves. And that can sometimes mean abandoning or moving away from what's within us, moving away from our agency, from our faith, moving away from God, moving away from the here and now. Because climate change can re-stimulate inherited patterns. And this can make it more likely that we are inclined to fall forward into that fearful future that I mentioned. So what do we do with all this? We don't just say, oh, it's hopeless. We don't just say, oh, I'm hopeless. We don't just say, oh, history of trauma makes this future impossible to imagine with hope. So if you remember at the beginning, I spoke about gentle curiosity. And we can also bring gentle curiosity not just to our reactions to climate change, but we can also bring that gentle curiosity to the question of how our past is shaping our present time responses to the future. And we can do that by reflecting on some questions. And I'm going to actually drop these questions now in the chat for us. These are just examples of some questions we can reflect on. Questions like, what is my family's or culture's or faith tradition's relationship to safety? What is my family or culture and or faith's relationship to questions of home? What is my family or my culture or my faith's relationship to ideas or experiences of vulnerability? And what is my family or my culture or my faith tradition's relationship to the idea of hope? So if you like, I encourage you to jot these down. This is a genuine invitation to journal on these, to reflect on these questions after our time together. And of course, it's important to know that if you're not able to answer these questions as fully as you'd like to on your own, you can always ask someone. You can ask a relative, whether older or younger than you. You can ask another member of your community, of your circles. And of course, these are just beginning questions, right? There may be other questions, other big questions that you want to explore, that you want to be able to chart from the past into your present and how it affects how you see the future. So take a few seconds now to jot down any questions you'd like to record or any thoughts that are emerging. And then I'm going to bring us home with a text study. The title for this evening session is When All Feels Lost, Look Back. Why do we look back? Well, we look back to see where we've come from, right? We look back to see how the past shapes who we are and who we're becoming. And we look back not just to map or mourn our losses, but also to be nourished and to be sustained. And we look back to see the values that are signposts for how we choose to walk into the future. And I'm going to share a text now that helps me look back as I'm looking forward. This is a text that we find in the Babylonian Talmud, a rabbinic compendium, in the tractate, the book called Sotah. And the Talmud in this bit of text that I'm about to share with you is worshipfully playing with a little bit of text from the book of Exodus, from Shmot in the Torah, or the Hebrew Bible. So I'm going to share my screen now. All right, give me a thumbs up if you're seeing something that says AES Summit. Okay, great. Thanks, Lashina. All right, so we start with the book of Shmot, the book of Exodus, and this is the very beginning of the book of Exodus. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, saying, "When you help the Hebrew women to deliver, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, "Every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." And a certain member of the house of Levi went and took into his household as his wife a woman of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. So we have here in this Torah text the beginning of the story of Moses. And we have the mention, even though not by name, Moses' father, Amram, a member of the house of Levi, and a woman of Levi, his wife, Moses' mother, Yocheved. So now we move to this worshipful playing, this midrash, focusing on the core text of the Torah. We have from the Babylonian Talmud, Sotah, page 12a. So the verse that we just read states, "And there went a man of the house of Levi and took for a wife a daughter of Levi." How did he go? And what the rabbis are playing with is, what does it mean he went and he took for a wife? We know that Amram was already married to Yocheved, so what is happening here? And a rabbi named Yehuda Bar Zavina tries to answer that question. And he says, how did he go? What does this mean? What did Amram do? Amram went according to the advice of his daughter Miriam. And he quotes another rabbi, another sage, who says, "Amram, the father of Moses, was a great man of his generation. Once Amram saw that the wicked Pharaoh said, 'Every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive.' Amram said, 'We are laboring for nothing by bringing children into the world to be killed.' Therefore he arose and he divorced his wife. And all others who saw this followed his example and arose and divorced their wives. Then Amram's daughter Miriam said to Amram, 'Father, your decree is more harsh for the Jewish people than that of Pharaoh. As Pharaoh decreed death only with regard to the males, but you decreed death both on our males and our females. And now no children will be born. Additionally, Pharaoh decreed to kill them only in this world, but you decreed in this world and the world to come, as those not born will not enter the world to come.' And Miriam continued, 'Father, additionally, concerning Pharaoh the wicked, it is uncertain whether his decree will be fulfilled. But you are a righteous person, and as such, your decrees will certainly be fulfilled. As it is stated with regard to the righteous, you shall also decree a thing, and it shall be established unto you.' And Amram accepted his daughter Miriam's words and went and remarried his wife. And all others who saw this followed his example and arose and brought back their wives." When all feels lost, I look back and I ask, what am I carrying forward? And this is one of the texts I carry with me. It's a reminder. It's a reminder to me to not let my fear deplete my imagination. And it's a reminder to me that particularly in the darkest times, hope is always present. And it's a reminder to me that that all our actions can have an impact in ways we don't even realize, we can't even know. And it's a reminder to me that small voices, that voices that are not traditionally held up or listened to, are our most important voices, and that we each have a contribution to make. And I wish that I could ask each of you, that I could sit down with each of you and I could ask you, what is your tradition? Who is your family? What is your culture? What is your source of nourishment in this moment? What carries you forward? I wish I had that kind of time. And unfortunately, I know that we are out of time. And so I'm going to turn things back over to Lashina and just say thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for learning with me. Thank you for sharing of yourself. And I believe we now have some time for some questions. So Lashina, back to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Rabbi Ora, for sharing your wisdom with us today. I'm sure many of us are feeling relaxed and challenged and inspired by your insights. Something that stands out, you shared about looking back, and it reminds me of the African Ghanaian phrase, Sankofa. And so one question that we've already, and before I step into the questions, as Rabbi Ora has already named, I want to remind you, if you have questions, to please put them in the chat, and we will do our best to get to them. And so, yes, that question, one of the questions that's already come up is, can you speak to some of the sources of inspiration or teachers who have taught you the skills and practices that you have been sharing tonight and you use in your work?
Oh, just a little question like that, eh? I mean, I have to say that I think of myself as an extremely grateful magpie. So climate change chaplaincy or eco chaplaincy is really in its nascent stages right now. It's a field that is just developing, that is just getting traction, that's just being recognized. And so I've been lucky enough to work with multiple folks to really be building this field together, which is deeply exciting and also requires each of us to be fantastically innovative and to be standing on the shoulders of folks who have come before us, maybe in other adjacent fields. So I look to some of the folks at the forefront of climate psychology right now. And I'm thinking of Leslie Davenport. I'm thinking of Ariella Cook-Shonkoff, who's a brilliant arts therapist who works in the fields of climate psychology. I'm thinking of my teachers, both actual teachers and patients in spiritual care and hospital and hospice and prisons and nursing homes that I've worked in. I'm thinking of my rabbis. I'm thinking of my colleagues. So, if I started to really name everyone, it would take us the next hour. And, to this question and to any of the questions that emerge, or if you have a question that you're not able to put in the chat or is not sufficiently answered, I will drop my email in the chat so that you can feel free to reach out to me directly.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So you also shared not to let fear deplete our imagination? What are some ways that you are able to stoke and ignite imagination in a time of such fear?
Yeah. So when I find my imagination depleted, and I'll be honest that that happens, not infrequently, because I am simply one person, and sometimes I am full of fear. Sometimes it feels like the fear and therefore the inability to see beyond my fear really fills me almost completely. And so when that happens, going back to the first question that you asked, I reach out to other people. And in that connecting, in that curiosity, in that hearing about what they're struggling with and what they're imagining for a positive future, for a challenged future, inevitably I get outside myself, and that stokes my imagination and reignites my curiosity and my capacity to keep going. Oh, Lashina, I think you're muted.
I love that. It's like a reconnecting with the earth through other people.
100%. Yeah, we can't do this on our own.
I love that. So another question is, Eastern and mindfulness teachings say to live in the moment. Nothing else can be lived. How does this square with the looking back perspective you just shared?
Mm, mm. I am certainly no expert in Eastern philosophy or in Eastern mindfulness practices. So all I can do is speak from my vantage point and my seat. And I'm thinking of a text, and I'm not going to remember the exact source, but there's a text, I believe in Midrash, that has one rabbi saying to another, if you hear that the Messiah is coming, finish planting the tree that you are planting, and then go and greet the Messiah. And so I think that speaks to the necessity of living simultaneously as much as we can in the present moment and meeting the needs and challenges of the present moment, while also simultaneously being oriented towards a hopeful future and simultaneously being oriented towards a transformative future. So being both in the present and the future, that of course calls us back into the past. So, seems like a tall order to be living in all three planes at once. But, if anyone has any insights and wants to write that into the chat, that would be wonderful too.
Well, I also love what you've done just through this practice today in grounding and centering. We have the space to entertain and engage that process. So thank you. Um, Another question asks, for those of us who may not know our biological parents or be able to trace back our family lineage, do you have recommendations for practices for looking back?
That's so important. Yeah, that's such an important question. And I will notice too, some of us are disconnected from our families of origin. Some of us, through trauma or loss or genocide, aren't able to make those connections, aren't able to ask those whose bodies and whose beliefs we carry forward in time. So I just want to honor the tenderness of that question. And also to acknowledge that, how did I exactly did I phrase it? I said family, culture, and faith tradition, I believe. And so we get to think, when we're wrestling with this question, of family writ large and of connection writ large. So we are inevitably shaped by more than the people that we come from. So that's one thing I'll say. You're not bereft in being equipped to start making this kind of exploration. And then another thing that I'll say is, this is a little fanciful and maybe not sufficiently honoring of the fullness of loss or the burden of loss. But if this feels like a delightful invitation, I'm going to share an invitation to imagine or reimagine your ancestors. In their absence, what do you want to imagine loving beings passing on to you?
That's beautiful. I think we have one more question, or so I'll just ask this question and see how you handle it. So you have invited us to a journey and a process. Do you have a workbook or other resources which might encourage and partially direct us to continue the dialogue with self, God, and others that your questions so far have invoked?
Thank you for that question. I do not at present have a workbook, but I do have availability to take on new clients. So I would invite you to visit my website. You can find more information about what we've been talking about today and about the process of working with me. And my website is exploringapocalypse.com. And you'll also find there little bit of background on why apocalypse and what apocalypse means when we look at it most broadly.
Okay.
Thanks.
Of course. So I think if that is it, I'm going to, yes, okay. Sorry, it's getting getting the go ahead. So I want to thank you again, Rabbi Ora, for your just your wisdom with us today. I'm sure so many people are just really pondering what you've shared, and truly grateful for your chaplaincy, your spiritual care, just your brilliance at handling such a tender and um, honestly a scary topic, right? The apocalypse, when we think about that. And so um, I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to have this conversation with you and share this space with you.
Thank you so much, Lashina.
You're very welcome. And so now I will pass it over to Faith in Places Wisconsin Outreach Coordinator, Tanya. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. That was so thought-provoking, and we thank you so much for that, Rabbi Ora. I feel like that was free therapy for me. But first of all, I just really want to say it was just so provoking. It was such a thought-provoking conversation. And also, I want to say thank you to you, Lashina, for guiding us through this with so much care. So as we conclude today, I just want to take a moment to thank each of you for being here. In these times of uncertainty, it's so important that we feel and experience that we weren't alone in facing these challenges. So, together with the strength of our spiritual traditions and communities, we can find the skill and wisdom we need. So, let's continue to explore our feelings and beliefs around climate because it guides our inner emotions spiritually, physically, and mentally. So, looking ahead to tomorrow, we would love for you to join us tomorrow for session 4, where Hilary Giavalle will be sharing insights into kinship and decolonial practices. She'll guide us in exploring how we can heal our relationships with the earth and one another. Then, for session 5, we will be welcoming Dr. Melanie Harris, who will be leading us in a conversation on eco womanism, exploring the intersections of race, spirituality, and environmental justice. And finally, don't forget about our bonus session on Thursday, September 26th. The focus will be Faith in Places Tree Canopy and Workforce Community Grant Opportunity. So if you are in Illinois, Indiana, or Wisconsin, and you represent a house of worship or a 501c3 organization in an environmental justice community, you won't want to miss this chance to learn how your organization could receive up to $30,000 for tree planting and maintenance projects. And as a reminder, please, you can also join HILO. That's our event networking platform to connect with others in your area or to continue the discussion after today's session. And the slides, the recording, and all of the resources for all of the summit sessions will be emailed out next week and available on our summit website. And additionally, after you join the last session, you'll be eligible to be in the drawing to win a $50 gift card. So we invite you to complete our summit survey, which will automatically enter you. And you can find that link in the chat, and it will also be emailed out as well. And again, as we close, thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to continuing this journey together as we move through the rest of the summit. And now this concludes the session, so everyone, please have a wonderful and restful night.